afternoon. Now, for something a little different, I appreciate the at least sense of irony by those who are working on the schedule, putting me into the tech track, um, hopefully rendering me even more confusing than usual. My emphasis for this afternoon is decidedly not of a technical nature. As I've said in years past, I will definitely leave the questions of how to others. I'm just personally more interested in some of the why questions and want to continue on a line of exploration that I've been pursuing the last few years under the heading of Theology, Myth, and the Settlement of a New World. We have only a few more days, I believe August 20th to be exact, when we'll once again note the anniversary of the launch of Voyager 1, and it will pass with no fanfare whatsoever. In fact, there will probably be few occasions for much celebration until Earth's most far-flung emissary exits the heliosheath. But the most famous image ever caught by that tiny craft, which has been alluded to, I'm not sure how many times already during this conference, but the infamous or famous pale blue dot, picture from 1990, continues to haunt the imagination of every person who beholds it. For Carl Sagan and for those who share his worldview, it was an image ultimately minimizing the significance of mankind, and the very phrase pale blue dot has become a trope for the insignificance of our world and our race. The association sentiment associated with the sentiment associated with it is to say, in essence, what care does the universe have for such a tiny world? In Sagan's words, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every hero, coward, creator, destroyer of civilization, every king, peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Powerful, poetic image, entirely unscientific, but a powerful image, and that doesn't diminish its significance. For such a sentiment, and often its attendant angst, was one which has been captured numerous times over the decades. In fact, one which I find particularly moving was from a poem first published in 1938, given the wonderfully encouraging title, "The World is Over." Who will be there when the world is over, when her streams are frozen and numb, when cinders lie where now the clover and the last of the birds is dumb, when the air stales and the sea hardens and the four seasons die? Who will there be to tell of our gardens and the glint of the evening sky? In other planets will love and laughter ring in another ear, but who in the years that are coming after will tell that we knew them here? Who to the planets that are our neighbors, or that swing round some other sun, will tell the tale of our hopes and labors? Ah me, not one. So let us rejoice in all beauty of shape, color, and song, knowing that earth released from duty may rest before very long. Dunsany strikes at that same anxiety of being capable of recognizing that the earth is a very small place. These observations speak to the questions of the heart when one contemplates the pale blue dot mythology. In a world where terms such as overkill and genocide are intended to package the unthinkable, the mythology associated with one image gives voice to a barely suppressed anxiety in the modern age, even as it simultaneously, and often without us even being aware of it, refutes its reason for being. In the midst of a very, very large universe, the earth is a very, very small place. And in all of that visible universe, only the human mind is known to be capable of precisely that reflection. Whether one is looking outward into the vast expanses of the universe while simultaneously looking back in time, or whether one is looking back at the earth from distances which stagger the imagination even as they pale to insignificance against the immeasurable cosmos. The image offers a participation in the myth through the simple act of observation being run through a sieve of preconceived worldview. Suddenly, the materialistic mythologist has determined that size matters, and if the earth is small compared to all of creation, then it, the earth and the whole saga of life on this world, on some cosmic scheme does not matter, and therefore humanity doesn't matter. Of course, both an ovum and a cancer cell are small in comparison to the whole body, but only a fool would say that it does not matter which one is present within a body. But the myth and the means of participation in that myth shape perception and one's sense of participation in that which is perceived. An inherent tension, even paradox, rests at the root of all myth, but the myth retains its evocative character. In a universe which lacks for a physical center, it is only human beings that we are aware of who know this fact or care that it may be so. Lacking a physical center, this pale blue dot therefore houses the only known material entities capable of contemplating their own significance and the significance of their environment. Unless and until another species appears which shares this contemplative capacity, Earth remains the center, functionally speaking, of our universe, because it remains an irreducible focal point for our observations concerning the whole of creation. Lacking a reference point which could be different and an equally compelling center of perception, Earth abides at the center of every myth relating the individual to the whole of creation. The myths participate in and give expression to every ontology and teleology known to mankind. For without myth, the various logoi do not root in the soul. Every one of us, therefore, needs that sense of myth. And I'm using the term here in the proper technical sense, not as it's casually thrown out as people speak of myth and what they actually mean as a fable or a fairy tale. But rather, myth is precisely a historical construction whereby we perceive ourselves in relation to the order of things around us. They relate to, fundamentally, the beginning of a thing. And mythically, we participate in that beginning through our ritual participation, in whatever form that takes, of that myth. Sometimes as simple as affirming the imagery of the pale blue dot connects us to the entire worldview that is captured in that picture. Every civilization has myths which define its essence. Myths are the means whereby individuals perceive themselves as partaking of that broader cultural association. Myth, therefore, in the proper sense of the term, is not pejorative. It's a term which describes the source of a set of core beliefs which defines any given civilization. So supposedly secular holidays, 4th of July, Dominion Day, Canada Day, September Mai, depending on your nation of origin, remain holidays as long as they are occasions wherein those who observe the rituals of the day are thus joined to the time commemorated in the observance. The etymological origin of holiday in the words holy day bespeaks the sacred mythical significance of any such observance, even when we perceive it, and perhaps especially when we perceive it to be a secular, neutral observance. That's the thing about myth. It gains more power the less we consciously pay attention to participating in it. That's why I'm amused sometimes when people talk about, well, what kind of religion should we have on Mars? What religion should we create to form a vision of a new society? And it keeps coming back to, no, you don't understand. That's not how mythic systems work. If you consciously create it, it's not a mythic system that functions in a way that people can relate to it. It's just fiction. Other holidays, Columbus Day, Guy Fawkes Night, for example, can be controversial on occasion precisely because of the annual participation in the commemorated event which is expressed in the observance. And here we're just still speaking of secular observances. And if humanity spreads to one or more new worlds, an enduring expression of the necessity of myth will be given form in the equivalent various forms of Founders' Days, when a first landing or formation of a new society will be commemorated by later generations by joining themselves ritually to that initial act by means of its commemoration. Such mythic commemorations may be accompanied by a meal which further communicates the bond of later observance to the mythic events. Thus, many centuries from now, young men and women may memorize and recite speeches which were first delivered by men and women who have been transformed into something more than mere mortals before they then sit down to communally consume a meal, the components of which may seem quaint at best, and yet which is retained year after year, precisely because the present participation connects them to the mythic past. One can still meaningfully use terms today, for those of us that are a little more dated, like Eastern Bloc, or more modern terms, Muslim world, Christendom, etc. Pick your broad categorization, because even though the nations and individuals who participate in such broader mythic associations have various national myths which also shape their identity, the myths have such theological associations to further define the individual in ways which interact with other mythic associations. So a Christian's participation in word and sacrament, or a Muslim's life being defined by the 5 pillars of Islam, or the Buddhist's 3 jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are all mutually exclusive systems. But each leads the individual into participation in that which transcends the individual and joins him to a shared ontology and theology. Indeed, one of the reasons why Marxism-Leninism was particularly successful for a time as a mythic system was that despite all of its purported secular character, it still presented a mythological construction of a semi-historical past, presenting economic struggles of human history and the celebration and veneration of heroes of that purported class struggle. So too, materialism has its mythic reconstruction of historical figures, some of the prominent ones being Copernicus, Bruno, Galileo, and the actual relation of the myth surrounding those people to the historical reality is not of particularly profound significance. In other words, the Giordano Bruno of history would be someone who modern materialists would metaphorically burn at the stake, but he serves a mythical role within their system, and so he's retained. An essential aspect of life as a human being is therefore participation in such defining cultural myths. Individuals participate in larger assemblies of human beings who share a belief concerning the origins of the universe, origin of life, and the significance both of the individual's life and the life of the species. As one scholar has observed, myth narrates a sacred history. It relates an event which took place in primordial time, the fabled time of beginnings. In other words, myth tells how, through the deeds of supernatural beings, a reality came into existence, be it the whole of reality, the cosmos, or only a fragment of reality, an island, a species of plant, a particular kind of human behavior, or an institution. Myth, then, is always an account of a creation. It relates how something was produced, began to be. Myth tells only of that which really happened, which manifested itself completely. The actors in myth are supernatural beings, even if they didn't start out that way. That's the end of that quote. So too, each myth, including and perhaps especially those which are purportedly secular, are also theological, because they relate the civilization as a whole and the individuals who participate in that civilization to a worldview which gives definition to lives experienced within that civilization by expressing that life in its connection to that which transcends individual experience. Thus, for example, both the affirmation and the denial of a divine purpose for a civilization are both theological statements. Without a perceived transcendent principle, a civilization does not and cannot exist. Myths bind together those individuals who believe themselves to be part of a civilization. Myths define where they come from, and so therefore also where they're going. Certainly the great myth of the American frontier was crucially important for us defining who we are as a people. And historians can debate the reality of various aspects of it. That doesn't undermine its mythic significance, which endures to this day. It's something which you can still refer to and get people either excited or very angry, but almost no one has a neutral reaction to such a mythic structure. Therefore, it's still a valid myth and culturally in play. A participation in a civilizational myth thus transcends time through the act. Thus, again, to quote from Eliade, in most cases, it is not enough to know the origin myth, one must recite it. This, in a sense, is a proclamation of one's knowledge, displays it. But this is not all. He who recites or performs the origin myth is thereby steeped in the sacred atmosphere in which these miraculous events took place. Attempts to demythologize humanity's perception of the past and our present participation in the origin of our species has led to what Eliade refers to as the terror of history. And I quote, "And in our day, when historical pressures no longer allow any escape, how can man tolerate the catastrophes and horrors of history, from collective deportations and massacres to atomic bombings, if beyond them he can glimpse no sign, no transhistorical meaning? If they are only the blind play of economic, social, or political forces, or even worse, only the result of the liberties that a minority takes and exercises directly on the stage of universal history." End quote. Not all mythologies are equal. For example, various modernist ideologies endeavor to fulfill the explanatory role, but ultimately fail because they cannot disperse the terror of history. The various progressive ideologies have imagined finding a unifying meaning of history, but have endeavored to do so without ever transcending mankind. The result has been the deification of economic or evolutionary forces, but since these efforts do not actually transcend the purportedly quantifiable, they lack explanatory value when it comes to placing the individual in relation to origins and ends. They cannot answer why there is a beginning or an end, and a purpose for either or both. The ideologies simply deify methodology, what is purportedly observable on a day-to-day basis, and try to infinitely extrapolate such processes. Such abstractions cannot sustain a civilization, and man does not exist apart from civilization. Case in point. We've already heard invoked, I think even just today, the powerful mythic image of both our connection to our human past and Africa, and see ourselves as a point somewhere along a continuum from that construction of a past history, the historical details of which are largely unknown and even unknowable, to an indeterminate mythic future where mankind sees this as little more than the beginning of our species. This is a mythic construct which allows us to understand our place within that broader civilizational purpose. You've already taken certain things for granted by the time you construct a myth of that nature. And in fact, it arises from previous frontier myths and is the continuation of that self-perception. So that's a little bit of a way in which we rightly view such a civilizational myth. Again, as Lewis Mumford observed several decades ago, man might even be defined as a creature never found in a state of nature, for as soon as he becomes recognizable as man, he's already in a state of culture. In the rare exception of wild children who survive only through animal compassion, they not only lacked both the skill to walk erect and use words, but were closer in character to the animals that they had associated with than to men. In fact, never learned to be fully human. Mumford's point is that by participating in a culture, by being part of a civilization, you already have that role of myth in self-definition. You are already part of something which is greater than yourself, and thus it's constantly a necessary part of the defining characteristic of man to always speak relationally. We like, especially in our culture where individualism is something which is held up as a virtue and has led to great results in terms of scientific exploration, technological development, and so forth. Nevertheless, we always have to relate ourselves in terms of connection to other people. We speak of ourselves vocationally or nationally. No one who is flesh and blood can speak of himself as simply I am. You have to always be relating yourself to another. And so we remain culturally rooted at all times. And because of that connection, we are therefore already predefined to some extent. new worlds would be filled with men and women who participate in civilizations which are their own, but which will at the same time exist to some extent in a state of continuity with civilizations which have preceded them, even if they are forgotten historically. Methodologies and technologies change, but such matters are not of the essence of mankind. Rather, they are brought into the service of humanity. Civilization, mythically defined by a present participation in its own origins, continually reifies fundamental principles that might otherwise seem to be mere abstractions. Thus, for example, the Spartans at Thermopylae or George Washington and the troops at Valley Forge can teach a doctrine of liberty with greater eloquence than all of the tracts of a John Locke could ever hope to attain. 100 generations of saints and martyrs have drawn steadfastness in suffering from Christ's words, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." For they received as the words of him who is the Word made flesh, and who offered up his life for the sins of all mankind. Civilizations live and die by their participation in a shared vision. We speak of men having their dreams and aspirations, but a people, a civilization, by definition, shares in a common vision as well. And where that vision is lost, neither force of arms nor economic necessity can long bind together what has been sundered. To again quote from Mumford, "To suppose that man's physical needs account for all his activities is precisely what must now be questioned. He is the one creature whose external activities we once more begin to see cannot be fully accounted for without reference to a most peculiar kind of interactivity, the dream. Only in man do we have a plenitude of positive evidence that dream images constantly invade and quicken the waking life. Only in him do they sometimes supplant reality to his peril or profit. If dreaming did not, in fact, leave visible imprints on human conduct, it would be only by each individual's own experience in dreaming that he would be able to accept without incredulity the reports that others give about their dreams." Mumford's point is that such mythic structures are then, in essence, a shared dream. Whether for good or for ill, they are something which motivates a people to a common end. The first generations of any given civilization, therefore, help to shape that definition. Radically different visions for the future of humanity are now in conflict within our own society, and the future of not only our own civilization, but the possibility of life spreading beyond the earth depend on the outcome of this conflict. When you have mythic structures which view humanity, for example, as a parasite, that's going to lead to a very different view of where our civilization should progress. If you have a mythic construct which sees man forever opening new frontiers and expanding and being an emissary of life, that leads to a very different direction for the civilization. The understanding we have of the nature of humanity, the value of life, and the hope which we have for the future shapes the civilization we have today, and that which will, in turn, shape future generations. The most important bequest that can be imparted to the future is a civilization worthy of the name. And to hand on such a bequest, we must first embrace the patrimony which has come down to us. The shared dream leaps almost timelessly between the generations and nations of mankind. The fusion of sacred and secular history and the participation in the past which comes through myth have united the generations across the rise and fall of empires and languages. Perhaps in time, it will leap between the worlds, and a new world will be built not only from glass and stone and steel, but on a foundation of Moses, the prophets, him who is the Word made flesh, and all of the other creeds and philosophies of men will play their role in shaping those myths as well. Such a civilization will be inspired by the history of innumerable generations and the rites, rituals, and dreams received from those who are now long dust, men and women who would thus give a shape to a heritage among the distant worlds. That pale blue dot would thus be seen not as an insignificant speck in the limitless black, but as a spark leaping outward, carrying life lived with meaning and purpose to the bounds which have been established for it. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
All right, we have time for a couple questions if anyone would like to ask some.
We have time for just one or two. Yes.
Thank you, Reverend. I don't want to be disrespectful towards you, but
It's fine.
I sat here for 35 minutes listening to your lecture, and maybe, quote, I might be a dumbass, but I really don't get the gist of your lecture. So maybe you can explain to me in a very succinct, clear sentence the main gist of your presentation. And secondly, my question is, with regards to a new civilization and a new world, and specifically here, we're talking about Mars, why would we want to replicate what we've done so dismally here on Earth with regards to taking human secular religion and having to take that model? Why can't we just develop a whole Martian religion or even have no religion?
Well, to answer the last part first, everyone has a religion, and especially those who claim to be secular. Because be more specific, everyone does theology. No one more so than the atheist. Because everyone has those principles which they believe to be true concerning the ultimate origin of life, the meaning, if any, of life, your place within it. And if you maintain, well, there is no purpose to my existence, and all of this is simply random chance, that's still a theological statement. And the power of that myth, that theological statement, is precisely found in the fact that the adherent of that myth says, no, that's not a myth, that's a fact, and becomes viscerally angry in reaction to it. My point is precisely one of every civilization, by definition, will have formative myths which shape it, and that this isn't something that we cause, not consciously. This is an inescapable reality of the formation of any society. Plant a colony on Mars, and it will have a given mythic structure that will be determined by those who make up that civilization. That is an attendant consequence of having a civilization. And that my purpose in bringing this forward is so that we can perhaps better understand our own reasons for why we're doing what we're doing. Most of the people who come to a Mars Society convention, including those who are active within the technical fields, do so not because this is simply what they do to draw a paycheck. You know, well, I had to do something with my life, I might as well build rockets. They do it because they feel this matters for some reason. Their motivation is not simply a matter of, well, I better do something or else I'll starve. It's they believe this has a purpose and they're doing it for a reason. And to the extent that they have reason and purpose, they participate in myths. And that's the point. Yes. Yes, sir.
I was going to rush to your help, and I've decided that I draw from you that what we take with us, whether it be to Mars or the desert or wherever, is either jewels or baggage. You didn't say Jesus, you didn't say any particular direction, but what we take with us, along with what everybody else brings with them and how we get together, is going to establish all of these myths, religions, morality that is going to develop one way or another.
Exactly. And that we all participate in far more of those kind of influences than we'll ever really be conscious of. Some of them are easily identified, and that's why I flagged a few of them that were kind of in our faces culturally. But a lot of them have deep roots that we may not even know the point of origin.
And color notwithstanding, established religions notwithstanding, we are going to do this with what we bring with us, only because that's our nature.
You never start with a blank slate, precisely. Yes, sir.
I have a number of friends across the theological spectrum, as do we all. And it strikes me that the most determinedly anti-religious among my friends are like fish who are unaware of the water in which they swim. And I just wonder if it's in any sense important to make them aware of the water.
Well, I think as long as it's understood that we're, to keep your analogy, that we're all swimming in it, it's just a fact of being human. We are compelled to have answers which are sufficient for us with regard to the question, why am I here? And is there any purpose to what I'm doing? You can't, with the exception of perhaps an extraordinary individual, it is difficult to live without some kind of answer to that question which you find meaningful. And it's not my purpose here today to define the answer to that for anyone. I'm simply saying you can't avoid answering those questions as an individual and as part of society. And because you are who you are and what you were born into, certain answers present themselves more readily than others. That's what it means to be part of a civilization.
Let's take one more question.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you again. Your presentation. You're a wonderful writer. It's very stimulating in how you write and how you present. I would encourage you, and this is unsolicited feedback, that of all the people who present here at this conference, you have the ability to initiate this kind of dialogue we're having. And so I would encourage you, next time you come, to just present for 10 minutes with your brilliant prose and then open 20 minutes of conversation, because we've got some really intelligent people in this room who I think would open a dialogue that would be really interesting. And unless, you know, except now we have only 3 minutes to do the same thing. So I think that's also what we've initiated. So.
Thank you for your very kind words. And I know that this is a discussion that will continue. It doesn't have to just be in here. Thank you. Thank you all.